Good evening, everyone. My name is Deidre McPherson. I'm MoCA's Curator of Public Programs, and thank you for joining us for tonight's program, Conversations, It Runs Like Clockwork, Automatons, Artificial Hearts, and Machines of Medicine. Tonight's program ties in really well with our current exhibition, Stranger. Stranger features the work of 9 international artists who explore a common theme, the human figure, and what does the blend of body and technology mean. Also on view on our second floor is Xavier Cha's Abduct, a captivating new video commissioned by MoCA Cleveland that explores uncontrollable emotional states. To learn more about our upcoming programs, please pick up a copy of our membership magazine. It's called Push, and you can pick up a copy of that on our ground floor at our visitor services desk. And last housekeeping item, if you would please share your feedback with us on tonight's program. You probably noticed there is a survey on your chair from us, and your feedback really helps us with our program planning. So if you could do that, and when you submit it at our front desk, you'll be entered into a drawing to win a pack of tickets to come to our silent disco party. I don't know if any of you have ever been to a silent disco party, but it's pretty epic. It's very fun, and it's going to be a closing party at the end of our season in May. And now, without further ado, I'd like to welcome Dr. Brandy Scalace. Dr. Scalace writes at the intersections of medicine, history, and literature. As a scholar and field researcher, she works to uncover unique and powerful stories, proving truth is stranger and more fascinating than fiction. Brandy works as research associate and public engagement fellow for the Dietrich Museum of Medical History at Case Western Reserve University, and she is the managing editor of Culture, Medicine, and Psychiatry, a cross-cultural medical anthropology journal. In addition to writing for the Huffington Post, Inside Higher Ed, and the Center for Medical Humanities, Dr. Scalace has written or edited a number of books, including Unnatural Reproductions, which explores the science and history behind steampunk. We are very pleased to have Dr. Scalace. Please give her a warm round of applause.
Hello. So nice to see all of you here today. I am very excited about this particular talk. I don't know if you've been to the Dietrich Medical History Center and Museum. It's across the street from Severance Hall. I like to call it Severance Light. It looks kind of like it. It is a museum that you might not have heard about. We're a bit of a hidden gem, though I think we're kind of creeping out of the shadows now. And we do medical history. Not babies in bottles, not bodies in jars. We are the medical technology history. So what we have are the machines of medicine, which is partly what we're going to talk about today. Clockwork. It runs like clockwork. When we hear that, we think of minute, precise movements. I like watches. Do you like watches? Mine's huge. I love watches. I have a lot of them. They make us feel like, yeah, things are in control. We're in control of our destiny. We run like clockwork. But what happens when that connection between body and machine overlap? And is the body a machine in the first place? I'm going to be exploring some of our medical history, but I'm also going to be asking some esoteric questions. You know, you're in an art museum right now. And at the MoCA, you're in this exhibit called The Stranger, which is sort of problematizing the body as a site of identity. And we're going to talk about that today as well, not only in the short talk that I'm going to do, but in a mini panel. And then this is the really fun part. You get to talk. We'll do round tables, which means I'm going to separate you into small groups. It'll just be like group work in college. I used to teach college, and group work is what professors do when they run out of material. They're like, I was going to talk about group work. That's what we're going to do. So today, hopefully this works, yeah? Oh, yeah. This is supported by a couple of different people. The Dietrich Museum, of course, which you all have some flyers in your chairs, and I have some other goodies to give away, including some somewhat disturbing bookmarks and some somewhat disturbing cards. They've got bodies on them. Not real bodies, don't worry. But I'm also supported by the Inamori International Center for Ethics and Excellence. It's a long name, but it's fantastic. And if you haven't been over there, they do a lot of good programming. And also the Cleveland Medical Library Association support these events. I'm so happy to be here at MoCA as well. So, man and machine. Most people, when they think about artificial limbs, probably have a guesstimate about when those first started arriving. How many of you say, which century do we start seeing artificial limbs? Don't peek. What do you think? Anybody? Oh, I'll get you talking, don't worry. 1800s, so 19th century, anything earlier? Anyone else? 17th century? 16th century. This is from Ambrose Perret, and he was writing about and creating prosthetics in France in 1579. And if you can see here, it's beautiful, it's a lovely illustration, and he was thinking about how things should work and how you could make the mechanics useful to people. He worked a lot with veterans. He worked a lot with people who had been injured in wartime, and he thought it's unfortunate that they don't have a means of getting beyond this injury. Maybe I'll create something. So some of the earliest drawings we have are his own. He was a military surgeon. And we continue to see these kinds of devices over time. And this is quite fun. These are appliances for use with a mechanical substitute arm. So you see that we've got a fork and a spoon. And it wasn't exactly like, a super useful arm. It's more like an extension. And you could kind of, work it out that way. There's some little pinchers there. And that's a pair of scissors. Scissors. Clothespin. I like that one. I'm not quite sure what you'd use that for. We also have these. There we go. But these drawings go back a lot further than that. And some of my favorite stories go into the 17th century, 17th and 18th century. We have a time period in the 18th century, the Enlightenment, where science gets kind of sexy. And people start wanting to do things with science. They're experimenting with this weird thing called electricity and the mechanics of bodies. They figured out that the human body was like a machine, or that hydraulics and the human body were really similar. So one of the things that they did is they started creating these automatons. And they thought, this is amazing, we've figured out the mechanics. It's only gonna be a matter of time, right, before we just make people. It'll be easy. And several hundred years later, we're still trying to make that happen. It's not easy. The mechanics are easy to figure out. We move. It's not that big of a deal. It's making it move, that's the trick. So they understood how to make bodies move so long as something else was engaging them, something else was turning the cranks, so to speak, making it work, winding the clockwork. Some of the more interesting ones were made by Jacques Vaucanson. That is his defecating duck. Yeah, scatological contrivance. Basically, people wanted to illustrate how the body worked. There was the flute player, who mouthed a flute with flexible lips and tongue and actually breathed into the instrument. There were talking heads. These were even creepier because they were trying to make the mouth make words. Have you ever actually seen a child as they're sort of trying to work this out? So they were mechanically doing this. And these heads are just, some of them are still around. They're horrifying. They sort of float in midair in a box, and they kind of do this at you. They move around and they try to make sounds. Some of my favorites, though, were the music players, or the writing boy. And Jacques Dreux was quite famous for creating these instruments here. The writing boy is fascinating because he stands about 2 feet tall. All the clockwork is inside his little body. He can write words, but that's not the best part. He's programmable. You could actually program him. He is, in some ways, the earliest computer in the 18th century to write words. The music player in the middle, the harpsichord player, she didn't just play the instrument either. She breathed, she sighed. In the 18th century, music was a very spiritual, and many argue it still is, a very spiritual thing. And so she would sort of, she'd just get really into it. Their idea of human bodies and replicating human bodies wasn't just about moving parts. It was about the soul. Because going back to Descartes, René Descartes, there was this idea of the beast machine and the man machine, that maybe humans and machinery were similar. 18th century machinery didn't just take the human body and say it's like a machine. They took machines and said, these are like human bodies. We want them to sigh and to feel and to replicate emotion. This is happening right now, by the way. I don't know if you were following, there's some robots being created in Japan to be greeters at different restaurants and sometimes department stores. And the one will cry if you upset her. So there's a way in which we are still trying, I don't know how I feel about that, but we're still trying to replicate what does it mean to be human? It's a good question. They were asking this question a long time ago. But possibly more interesting to me than man versus machine is woman versus machine. What is a woman machine going to be like? You like this one here. This is Mall Handy. She's supposed to, she's got some little utensils. She'd clean your house. This was never actually built, just someone's idea. But there were machines created. And one of the problems is that in the 18th century, they're creating these women machines. And they're saying these women are like machines, and that might seem okay, except it's during a time period when women were thought to not actually be fully human. And so they were thought to be like clockwork, in fact. So Judith Drake, she argues about this in 1721. She says, she's worried that they were considered mere machines, a sort of divine clockwork that acts only by force of nice unseen springs, without sensation, and cry without feeling pain, eat without hunger, and drink without thirst. And Mary Estelle, another woman writing at the time, says we're being treated as little useless and impertinent animals or mere machines. So this was worrisome. They wouldn't allow women to get educated. They were afraid that if you put a lot of things in their brain, all the blood would kind of go up there and their ovaries would dry up and they wouldn't be able to have children. I'm getting this out of medical books, so I have them. They're over there at the Dittrich Museum. I can prove it. They did. They thought that if you educated yourself, you wouldn't be able to have children. Women saw some problems with that because they said, well, don't you want us to educate the children once they come out? Shouldn't we have some education to get going on with that? When René Descartes came up with Cartesian dualism, where he said that the mind is separate from the machine of the body. Well, why would he say that? Anybody want to guess? What would happen in a time period, say, when religious fervor might get you thrown in prison, if you said that the body was just a machine? Anyone want to guess? You might be thrown in prison. You might get burned at the stake. There's other things that could happen too. But essentially, he wanted to separate the soul from the body. It must be separate if the body's merely a machine. So you have this kind of interesting connection. And once Descartes said, oh, the body's a machine, but the mind and the soul and the heart, they're totally different, women were like, okay, my body can make babies and my mind can think. This is okay. So they argued for education using this separation of machine and mind. And it's interesting because with modern AI, we're in fact trying to re-meld those things together. So it's kind of interesting. Other problems, whoops, these are fun. These are actual women machines. In the 18th century, mostly, so up to the 18th century, if you were going to give birth, there was going to be a midwife, and the midwife was going to be a woman. In the 18th century, that all changed, but they didn't change the name, which I find very funny. So they just started calling them men midwives. Yeah, makes perfect sense. So they wanted to practice with a new thing, tools, forceps. Have you ever seen them? I have a large display at the Dittrich Museum. I once gave a tour to a group of young men, and when I explained where those went, one of them passed out. They go in. Could be quite dangerous, and sometimes they would puncture women's bladders with these, and that's bad, and can kill you. So they decided men needed practice, but not on real women, so they built some fake ones. They all have breasts and nipples. I always thought that was kind of funny. So you don't really need them if you're a machine. Actually, Mall Handy does too. Anatomically correct, right? This is an Italian one. We have some images of this, and we actually have one at the Dittrich. They're alarmingly lifelike. This is the one we have over there that you can have a look at. Yeah, it can be. It's a beautiful object and also somewhat alarming to just walk in and see a partial woman. Many of them are like this. They're just stumps. They don't actually go full out. Theophilus Parvin, he gave his socks and a face and hair. I'm not quite sure why. But it doesn't exactly look like it's meant to just teach you to deliver babies, frankly. But women were worried about this, and they said, we don't want to be mere machines. We want to be more than that. But by the time you leave the 18th century behind, one of the things that comes along is you realize that it's much more difficult to create a mechanical human than we thought, and it's much more difficult to replicate these things. But we also have a great deal of disturbances, right? The Industrial Revolution, terrible accidents. I'm going to show you something. Say hello to my little friend. Can't believe I just let you record that. Okay, so these are from the Dietrich. They come with gloves, which I think is very interesting. These are heavy. Somebody want to hold one? Anyone? Okay, all right. Just hold that for a minute. Imagine wearing that on the front of a disabled arm. It's pretty remarkable. Yeah, it's not what you expect, is it? Anyone else wanna? They're very heavy. They're very heavy. It's hard to get to you there. If you just kind of see the, it's like pretty serious heft. Because it's metal, the front hands part of this is metal. The story behind these is rather tragic. I'll just leave them hang out here. Young man in college, I believe it was a drill team, is loading a cannon with a stick, and it goes off. It doesn't blow off his arms, it literally yanks them off. That's a very unfortunate way to lose your arms, and these were created for his use. So we have accidents of that nature. There's industrial accidents, but there's also an awful lot of war and disturbances of those natures. There's conflict. People are losing their limbs. If you've ever read anything about the Civil War, it's just disturbing. Walt Whitman actually served as a nurse and talks about piles of body parts that you wheelbarrowed out there every day. Waterloo, the Battle of Waterloo, Charles Bell actually does oil paintings of some of the wounds that he saw in the amputations. We have a very large collection of amputation sets, by the way. The cameraman back there knows that I talk about awful things in all of these. At some point, I'll tell you the story of Robert Liston, who could remove a leg in 2 minutes or less. But we need replacement parts. Replacement parts become a really big industry. And I like this image. This is an advertisement, and she's just like handing out. She's sort of this angel of replacement parts. She's handing things out. But we also have a very interesting connection to Cleveland. Wilhelm Kolff, who was here. He was a Dutch physician. He invented the first artificial kidney when he was back home during World War II, using sausage casings and orange juice cans and all kinds of strange things to build it. I think a washing machine was used to build the one that we actually have one of the Wilhelm Kolff's artificial kidneys at the Dietrich Museum. It's not on display, it's quite large, so it's downstairs in the basement storage. But Wilhelm didn't stop with artificial kidneys. He was also interested in artificial hearts. He invented the Jarvik 7, or he worked on the Jarvik 7 with Jarvik, and a lot of other pieces. There's the original. This is the one we have in our collection. It was a Maytag washing machine, and Maytag refused to let them to keep using it because they were like, we don't want to be attached to or liable for anything going wrong with dialysis treatment, which I guess you can understand. It's kind of interesting because the story behind the artificial kidney also talks a lot about, what's happening there? There we go. About who is allowed to use these technologies. Who has a right to use these technologies? It was so expensive that they actually had panels trying to decide if you had sufficient social net worth in order to get dialysis treatment. And that's one of the reasons why dialysis is actually universally available today. But there's some other ones. These are fun. What do you think these are? I should mention these are quite small. This is actually a marble in there, or the size of a marble. They're heart valves. They're so small, I was kind of afraid to bring any of them over here because they're little tiny things. These are artificial heart valves, early ones that were used. And believe it or not, these technologies were being used a lot earlier than most people realize. This over here is also another one of the different kind of artificial hearts. And Wilhelm was famous for saying, if a man can grow a heart, he can build one. You gotta like that, right? Whoops. We have a lot more artificial parts in the world. And you can see that these earlier models, they were large, they were clunky, they were heavy. And believe it or not, artificial legs are easier to use. People have a much easier time using artificial limbs. Something about the walking process, actually you've got kind of speed and gravity works for you in some ways. Artificial arms are much more difficult. But nonetheless, we are working on more and more complex versions of this, including artificial limbs that help you feel. At the Global Center, I gave a talk on electricity, and we talked about FES, or functional electrical stimulus, and that's something that they're implanting into your brain to move and control your muscles or your limbs. Here's one of the more advanced artificial arms. But artificial arms are much more difficult. And they're difficult for the same reasons that, though it's been 200 years of figuring out the mechanics, we haven't really created a very functional robot, though some of the stuff coming out of Boston Dynamic is somewhat frightening. They're abusing the robot. Have you seen the video? Boston Dynamic, they abuse the robot. I'm like, don't you know about Skynet? Don't make it angry. I want to apologize to it afterward. But we are getting more and more complex in these devices. And yet, arms are not intuitive. The things that go on in your brain to get you to raise your hand, wiggle your fingers, just do it. You're using so much of your brain right now. It's amazing. We don't even understand where all of it comes from. And we do it involuntarily. Your forehead itches, right? Immediately, you do that. You don't sit there and go, okay, bend the elbow. We don't do that. But you would have to. It's a very complicated thing. Arms are not easy. And just like in the 18th century where they thought, surely this is going to be in the next couple of years, it's just right around the corner, all the advances we make, we might still not be just right around the corner. Because having a replacement part is actually not always an easy thing to do. This is one of the more advanced prototypes that is being used right now for arms. And you can see there is a world of difference between the way these move and function. But what interests me is that outside of the science is very fascinating, but outside of the science, how do we as human beings connect with and think about the body as ourselves? And I ask this, how many of you have ever had an arm go numb on you, like completely numb? Is it not the most alien thing in the world? Now imagine that you have an artificial limb. That's something that's part of you, and yet you may not feel entirely like it's part of you. It's complicated. The body is not always something we live in the way that I think we become very aware of our bodies when we're sick, for instance. I was talking about what I was going to be doing this evening, and one of my colleagues has just been really ill, and she's like, I don't know, I feel like a body today. I'm not a cyborg, I'm not post-human today, I'm just all body and snot, and because our bodies, they impress themselves upon us at times, sometimes when we don't want them to. They become invisible at other times. Where do we live in this matrix? And what are we afraid of, too? Because most of the robot movies that I've seen don't end well. They don't end well. Cyborg movies never ends well. Why is that? That goes all the way back, by the way. One of the earliest books that incorporates an automaton was published around the same time as Frankenstein. E.T.A. Hoffman's The Sandman. And a young man falls in love with his neighbor's daughter, Olympia. And she's beautiful and she sings, so she must be great. And he proposes marriage and she gives him very ambiguous replies and he thinks that's a yes. Only to discover later that she's an automaton. And the person who built her comes back for her and runs away with her. He does leave the eyes. I don't remember why, but the eyeballs stay. But he runs away with the rest of her. There's going to be a ballet down at the Playhouse, which is about, I know, I was really excited, actually, to find out. But we have this fear of, what if we can't tell the difference? What if we aren't different? And I think that this gallery, in many ways, is bringing that to our attention. What are the problems of where the body actually is? What are the psychologies behind mechanics of medicine, of our own bodies, of our minds? And what do we personally think about ourselves as cybernetic organisms. My phone is like an organ in my body. I don't know what to do when I can't find it. It's like an extension of my hand. Are we all kind of cybernetic? Are we all just bodies? It's an interesting question. And so, what I'd like to do now is invite our panelists up, and we're going to have a bit of a discussion, partly about the gallery space and what it offers, partly about what it might mean to have a replacement part and how you might feel about it. And so I invite you to welcome our guests up here, and we will have another little chat. So I'm going to actually allow you to introduce yourselves, but I'm so glad that they've joined us. We actually did have another speaker, Carl West, from the Cleveland Clinic, but he wasn't able to make it. So instead, I present Kim Schaub and Laura, who's actually at the MoCA. Kim?
My name is Kim Schaub, and I am a psychologist at the Cleveland VA Medical Center. I work in the Department of Cardiology, and my primary responsibilities in the facility are to take care of patients who are admitted to the hospital with cardiac disease, who need a solid organ transplant of any kind, or who might need what we call a ventricular assist device, which is an artificial heart pump. And so my job is to integrate into the medical team and address the psychological issues that patients who need these kinds of devices might experience in the process of their care.
Am I on here? My name is Laura Ziewitz. I'm curatorial assistant here at MoCA. So I assisted with some of the research and some of the writing behind the exhibition you see around you. And then also, actually, I am diabetic and I wear an insulin pump, so I have a machine very much as part of me, which is another tie I actually didn't even think about until you started talking. So.
Great. What I want to ask, I'm actually going to ask Laura first to say a bit about this gallery that we're in, because I don't know if you've had a chance to look at it already. There's these connections between sometimes animal and human and machine and human. What is that doing here? What's kind of the message of the gallery space here?
Sure. So this exhibition, Stranger, is premised on this idea of encounter between you and a work of art. So how does it feel when you meet a work of art, so to speak? So as I hope you've noticed, even if you hadn't had a chance to fully look around, you'll see a lot of faces that at first seem to be familiar, but then as you draw closer, look a little deeper, you realize, oh, something's a little off about that. It's sort of this instinctual moment of recognition, and yet something's different, something's strange. So that's the basic idea behind the exhibition. So we have some artists, particularly in this first gallery, that are working in more art historical tropes, sort of classical portraiture, expressionism, moving into surrealism when things get really weird, and then even some artists that are looking into the future of artificial intelligence and when, what does it look like when we move beyond needing to have a body.
Okay, great. Kim works over at the VA with people who have had these devices, and so I'm interested to know, and I'm hoping you'll share with us, what's that intersection like for people, and what kind of responses do people have? I know my dad has a pacemaker and defibrillator inside. I just hit the thing. Inside his body, and it's now actually become part of his body. You no longer see the outline. It's just sort of absorbed into his body, and there's not even a mark on the skin. But some people have external devices too. So can you say a little bit about the connection between man and machine?
So I think it differs for different people. As I listen to you talk about artificial devices, and particularly about the sense of self, the thing that strikes me is many people feel that in part that their sense of self lies within their heart in some ways. And so devices particularly that take over or augment the functioning of our heart can be particularly challenging for the people that I work with to think about. I think most people's first experience in thinking about devices is when we think about our advanced directives and what we might want toward end of life. So probably the most common thing I hear on a day-to-day basis, people talk about how they would never want to be attached to a machine. And that's a very common sentiment. And it's a particularly common sentiment when we're well. It's a different experience as people become ill and they face health challenges and difficulties breathing, and people begin then to think about the end of their life, and they start to think about technology and medicine differently. And I think that, you know, in a single day today, to share with you a little bit about my day at work today, I met with a patient who had severe heart failure who needs an artificial heart pump, and I'm going to show you one because heart pumps are external to the body and internal at the same time. So something that you can see, so this is the outside of the pump. The pump, one valve hooks into the bottom of your heart. The center here is a rotor. It spins your blood, and then there's another connecting tube to the main top portion of your heart where blood is pumped out to the rest of the body. But in order for this pump to work, our patients have to be plugged into power 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. They wear an external controller that is attached to the internal pump. So this attaches actually to the pump. The patient wears this outside, and this is attached to power. So if they want to be mobile, they have to carry batteries, and when they're at home, they literally plug themselves into electricity in the wall. They can't immerse themselves in water, and when they come for an appointment, you don't feel a heartbeat. They don't have a heartbeat anymore. They're working on pulsatility and the belief that you need that your heartbeat and that movement is essential to life. The challenges with a pump like this are that you form blood clots, and so you have to take medications that thin your blood, and then you risk bleeding. You can have infections when there are lines that exit your body. You can have strokes. So today, I evaluated a patient who had a heart attack 8 years ago, felt he died, and felt he experienced an event where there was a light and peace, and he didn't want to come back. And even though he'll die without the pump, he declined this technology. And a few hours later, I met with a patient in the intensive care unit who has a progressive neurological muscle disease that has required him to be on a ventilator. As the moment, he requires the ventilator at night to oxygenate his body, but over time, he will eventually require the ventilator 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And yet for him, he wants that to continue. He wants that support. As long as he can see his wife, point to letters on a blackboard, because he can't always speak with his trach unless he's wearing a particular valve that allows him to speak, even though he can't move from his bed. That's the most important thing to him. And so people are very different in their experience, and part of my job is to help people to think about this and what it would mean for them and what it means to their sense of self and how they define themselves. Some people define themselves by simply being with people they love. Other people define themselves by being independent and not attached in some way.
And that's really fascinating to me, and you'll all get a chance to talk about this as well when we have the small groups. But what I think is interesting about it is there's a lot of these, we used to call them historically halfway technologies. So for instance, in the polio outbreak in Cleveland, the big oxygenators, the big tanks that you sat in, those didn't cure you of polio, they just kept you alive until you got better, presumably. Though there are still people who use those and still need them to breathe, even maybe at night. And the pressurized tank, it breathes for you, it pushes on you, and then it sucks out again. And not everybody wanted to be in those either. They're very claustrophobic, they're very small. You're kind of inside, your head sticks out. We have an infant model at the Dittrich, because the full-size ones are gigantic. And there were so many people. The Toomey Pavilion was just full of these, and the strangest one I ever saw was a giant wall, and the heads just stuck out of the wall. So it was just a bunch of it was very Matrix-like. But these technologies aren't the cure. And these technologies aren't the cure, but they sometimes, I assume people are on heart transplant lists probably for some of these?
So heart pumps and the development of heart pumps initially started to help people who needed heart transplant wait for heart transplant. So kidneys, in fact, and dialysis are currently the only organ for which there is a bridge, if you will, till you receive a transplant. And in fact, the kidney list, there are many, many people and they're long lists. But if you need a heart, a lung, a liver, you don't have an option for life-sustaining treatments. And so ventricular assist devices used to be very large, much like the photo you saw of the initial dialysis. They were very large machines. You often remained in the hospital. But in our society, as technology and medicine has helped to extend people's lives, more and more people develop illnesses for which they need potentially new hearts, or they need to be able to augment their current heart functioning. And so because there are now so many more people awaiting heart transplant than there are donors, ventricular assist devices are now being used as something we call destination therapy. So destination therapy means that this is what we do to help you live longer. And the technology is expanding. The next generation of pumps is already well underway and under research, and they're levitational devices so that you don't have a rotor, which we know shears blood cells and creates problems. And they'll be pulsatile so that patients will have a heartbeat. And I suspect that someday heart transplantation will no longer be a necessary treatment option, that people will figure out how to help people live with pumps.
Great. Just to get back to some other kinds of assistive devices, for instance, the external artificial arms and things like that. You have in the gallery here a picture of a sculpture of a girl on a wolf, and she herself has an artificial arm. Can you say something about that, or what's the story there?
That's a great question. For those of you who can't see, her arm is this sort of sleek metal bionic arm. It's on the other side, facing the wall. Yeah, actually, this artist, this is a trope he uses in a lot of his work. He also has a video on view in this gallery right here where you also see this robot-type creature that has the same arm. You see it in a lot of his sculptures, but he hasn't confessed what it is about. He's very esoteric when he talks about his work, so you can only guess. I would say my interpretation would be this idea of, similar to what you've been talking about, is thinking about the body and how it can be improved and in what ways it can be used differently. But there's no answer that we have been told about that specific meaning.
There was a time when people mostly they didn't want these technologies necessarily to be seen. And one of the reasons there's gloves in here, right? If you put the glove on the hand, it's less obvious that you have a false arm. But even pop culture has actually kind of done some new things lately. If you saw Fury Road, Furiosa actually has a false arm. Even Train Your Dragon has a character in it who actually has part of a false leg. So in a way, some of these things are becoming more visible. And I think that tension between what's an invisible replacement part and what's a visible replacement part, when people meet my father, they don't know that he has a pacemaker and defibrillator. And some people who have other, like, replaced valves or other things, no one sees that. But if you have an artificial leg, if you have an artificial arm, it's something that's much more obvious to people. And I think that there's a level sometimes, particularly in the 19th century, of shame related to these devices. Sometimes it was because it was related to disease. If any of you watch, I think it's, what show is it, The Nick? With the false nose. People wore false noses if they had syphilis and they lost parts of their tissue. So there's a real strange dynamic between, are we proud of this device? Are we proud of our wounds? Or are we actually ashamed? Or are we frustrated? Are we just angry? And I'm sure this gets even more complicated with veterans, I would imagine.
It is. You know, many of our veterans have artificial limbs. We see people in the hospital every day with artificial limbs and the visible wounds of war. I think that there is certainly something, for some people it's a sense of pride in their service, and for other people it invites conversation from others, or it makes a statement about themselves that they feel uncomfortable making. It sometimes can be a sign of weakness or a sign of something that may be lacking or you feel is lacking. And I think when things are visible, the sense of yourself is more public for people to see, and it invites us, whereas generally it's something we choose to share or not to share. We get to make that choice. When something's visible, sometimes that choice is not available to us.
And actually, the Cleveland Humanities Festival is coming up this year, and it's reflecting on war. And there's going to be an event here, actually at the MoCA, that deals with veterans. I forget the name of it. Deidre can let me know. Warrior Courts, yeah. And then we'll also have an event over at the Dittrich, which is on war and nutrition. So if you're interested in those things, there's more coming up. What I'd like to do now, actually, first of all, thanking our panelists. Thank you very much for being part of that. I'm now going to shrink you into smaller groups where you'll discuss some questions that I've kind of drafted, and then we'll bring it back to the large group afterwards. So, does the body still work as a site of identity? Even today with Facebook and Twitter and half the friends you haven't actually met face to face, is the body still a site of identity? We see greater developments in biomechanics. What's your response to these possibilities? Does it make you excited? Does it make you worried? We all use body extending technologies. What are yours? We all have got them. At what point do we become bionic, or are we in fact machines all along? Do these questions about man and machine fascinate or frighten us, and how comfortable are we with our own clockwork? You don't have to get to all of them in your group. You can pick and choose from the mess. But sit down, have a conversation. That's why we call these that. And we'll come back to the larger group afterwards. Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to be asking you to share with me, and I'm going to run around, and you're going to get a mic from me, and we've got a mic runner right here. And so I want to hear from you, and you do need to stand up so that we can all see you as well as hear you. So who would like to share a little bit about what you were talking about? I heard some fascinating stuff. Okay.
Hello. Okay, so we actually got in this really interesting argument on number 3, which is body extending technology of some kind, and we were talking about glasses, and apparently there is a debate whether or not using glasses makes you bionic, because I argued that they do, by the fact that, like, if I didn't have my glasses on, right now I'm more or less blind. And so I need these glasses in order to function in society at large. I can't drive without these, and I can't really make out you, for instance, Brandy. Yeah, so, but then what was interesting is people in my group then disagreed with me that they are not bionic, which I find actually really fascinating. I know you didn't. I said some, not all.
Well, that's interesting. Anyone else want to comment on body extending technologies? Did anybody else talk about glasses or other body extensions? I heard people mentioning it. Okay.
We commented on not only body extending technology, but things like contact lenses. He has a titanium shoulder, knee replacements, shoulder replacements, all of those things help you live a better life. I don't know if it makes you bionic, but you feel better, because if you did not have them, you would be in pain, you couldn't see, you can't hear, like the hearing aids and things of that nature. And we also talked about number 1.
Oh, yes.
When we talked about Stephen Hawking's, when you identify your body, your body as a site of an identity. If those who don't know Stephen Hawking, or those of you who do, he's a paraplegic. He can't do anything but move his eyes, and that's how he speaks. They have some type of technology hooked up to him whereby his eyes move, and then you hear a voice.
He doesn't use it anymore.
Well, he has something better now, I guess.
Of technology.
But
that's great. So, in other words, does he identify with his body as himself? That's a good question. Anyone else tackle that one? Let's hear from some of the other groups back there. Come on, just pick somebody. I'll volunteer someone else if you don't want to volunteer. Just kick someone in.
I see smiles over here.
Oh, just give it to somebody smiling. That'll work.
I'd like to ask a question regarding what about stem cells? What about stem cells? How would we perceive it? Whether it's external, or would that be fair enough, or where's the fine line?
Stem cells. The question was, stem cells, are they external? Would they be extending, or would they be just internal and part of the organism? Is that, okay.
So sort of like, if we have implants which are designed based on stem cells,
Got it.
then would that be considered? Because these guys were discussing about having implants which are bionic or non-bionic.
I gotcha.
So how would you perceive that? Because if it's something which is living, would that be considered as
Okay.
bionic or not, or
Interesting.
something which is from outside world?
Oh, I like that. And it's a shame Carl's not here. Carl West, one of the things that he's working on are stents in the heart that actually become part of living tissue. And so they start off as a technology, and then your body sort of absorbs them, or I don't know exactly how it works, and he's not here. But it is a fascinating idea. Does it go in as a technology? Does it become part of the body? Rather than answering that question, I'm gonna ask you, what do you all think? What do you guys think? Is living tissue still like being a cybernetic organism, a machine, or does that mean something else, more organic? Do you want to take a crack at this?
Do I want to take
Yeah,
a
go
crack at
ahead.
that question? You know, that's a really good question. I certainly think that it has implications for how people view their identity when something is living versus when it isn't. The idea that stem cells can come, though, from someone else, one of the things that our group was discussing, which was so interesting, is the idea of organs coming from someone else. And what does that mean? Do you absorb personal identity from that source? We talked about the idea of face transplants. If my face doesn't look like my face anymore, I was really curious, because when I thought about for myself, is there some part of me that if I didn't have wouldn't make me feel like myself? I thought it's probably my face. But if you could grow that, 3D print that in some way, and it still felt consistent with how I defined myself or how I saw myself, I don't know if I would see it as bionic in the same way. It's a really good question.
Now I want to hear from the rest of where was your group? All right, group. I want to hear about this. Talk more about this. Give someone a mic. About whether or not living tissue would feel bionic or not. Yeah.
So I was thinking, at this point of view, we can extend the conception of bionic or not. If you just have any kind of prosthesis, like a transplanted part that can be heart, face, limb, or something that is still living, but is not part of yourself. So then I can understand, like, the face is right. I can understand it's really tough to accept the face is not you. But as I also answered when she actually raised that question in the beginning, is that if you look at these patients before the treatment, actually they lost their face already in a first step. So they actually were not, their face was actually not their face anymore. They already lost their identity. So this point of view, I think they didn't have an identity before. You're giving them a new one. Then if they like it or not, that's another problem.
What about avatars? And I bring this up because not everybody on social media, Facebook, Twitter, your email, etc., actually uses their own face. I have a friend who it's a picture of a crow, and she in fact calls herself Crow Girl, and I love that because I think that's a really interesting way of identifying yourself. So do we feel like our faces are our primary identity these days? Interesting question. Any other people talk about, which one was that? Site of identity? Anyone else talking about, or have thoughts about living tissue or organ transplants? Is that kind of the same thing? Is it new? Is it different? Does anybody know a transplant patient? You do. Anyone else? No? Do you? Anybody? Do you want to talk about
organ transplants? I shared with my group, in fact, that there's a very interesting phenomenon that occurs in transplant patients sometimes, that when you receive an organ from a donor, that some people feel that along with that organ, that somehow they have been imbued with some part of the identity or personality of the person from whom their organ came. And people struggle with that post-transplant. It can be something that can really be a challenge for them, feeling as though they are not themselves anymore.
There's actually a commercial that I saw, and it was about a dog follows his owner to the hospital and waits, and then a woman leaves and he runs after her instead, and it was a transplant commercial. And it's like, well, that's one way of putting it, right? Do you take part of yourself with you? Did anyone get to some of the other points? Anyone about, say, how do you feel about this technology? Does it excite us? Does it frighten us? Yeah.
I think it's easy for this kind of discussion to make us really nervous and nauseous. So it brings up these existential questions like, am I just this body, this bag of skin, or am I essentially a little bit part of everything? Like when I receive somebody else's organ, is that a real concrete demonstration that I am just a part of everybody else? Or I just think that's kind of interesting. But yeah, it does make me really queasy sometimes to think about.
Not everybody finds it frightening. Some people do. I think that it's an interesting idea that we could live outside of our bodies. I sometimes think if I could do that, I would make my body work out a lot more, because I don't like being there for that. And I would go do something more interesting. But at the same time, I'd like to get back into it eventually. And then I wonder, would it be like, would we have to get to know each other again? Would someone introduce us? Would I know myself? I think, therefore I am, that also comes from Descartes, the one who's questioning where the soul and the mind and the body lines are. Anybody want to comment on that? Yeah. This group's getting all the press over here. You got.
When you talk about the soul and the body, isn't that what meditation and the yogis do when they go deep inside themselves and levitate out of the here and now, that they're disembodying their soul from their body and going to another place? And I think they come back fine, as far as we know.
I don't know. I've never meditated, so I'm not sure. I'm always here. I'm always right here. Though I have heard that. People talk about out-of-body experience. You mentioned out-of-body experiences and your patients, too. That's an interesting concept. How did he feel when he returned?
Sadly, it was very sad, as his wife of 50 years sat in the room and he said, I didn't want to come back. He clearly loved his wife, but that was his response about that. And out-of-body experiences is interesting, and it was my thought when you were talking about could we live without our bodies. I sometimes think about social media and how we create an identity on social media, in a sense, without a physical presence. So much of how we create part of ourselves, I feel like it's in part appearance, but at the same time, it leaves the canvas pretty wide open when you think about using technologies and social media in some ways to create who you want to be, and sometimes authentically and sometimes inauthentically. And so I was thinking about that. I wonder how I would differentiate myself, or how I would create myself if I didn't have my physical presence to do it.
There's a work in the exhibition here again. There's a video work in this room right here that deals with this very idea of living online and online personas. It's narrated by a CGI figure called Phil, who is based off a very famous actor. It's very clearly Philip Seymour Hoffman, and he encounters all of these people, like an invisible woman who has been erased by a content-aware filter, and this holographic Japanese pop star that apparently has a huge following, all these other characters that only exist online in this digital realm. And so it brings up these very ideas of, where is your self located if it's not in your body? Can it be on this realm? So if you're fascinated by that, you should definitely check out this video in this room. Yeah.
I find all of these questions pretty interesting. I write about death, and I also write about birth, so I get you coming or going. But my book about death is called Death Summer Code, and I was on the John Fugelsang show a couple weeks ago, and he described the body as a meat jacket, and that stayed with me. But some people called in. It was a call-in show. No one told me it was going to be. And I got some really disturbing questions. One was, I had a terrible relationship with my father. He was a bad person. When he died, no one wanted his ashes, and I got stuck with them. What should I do? And I went, I don't know. But it's an interesting point, because her feeling was, okay, yes, it's ashes, but it's still a body. So our connection to this body sometimes transcends death, and I talk a lot about that in the book. I have a chapter called Eat Your Dead and Other Advice. Necrophagy, the Wari tribe used to eat the dead afterwards to reincorporate them into the family so that they wouldn't be separate from them. This is also a really unhealthy practice, FYI. Pro tip, don't do that. But it's a really interesting idea that the body is such a site of meaning for us in life and in death. So I'm fascinated partly by this sort of questions about where the machine and the man line really is. By the way, man-machine, l'homme machine in French, I'm not saying, I realize that it's not PC, but it's actually what it was called by Descartes, so the human machine. I find that fascinating because we don't stop caring about the body as a site of identity when the body's gone. And one interesting point to get us back to social media is Facebook can memorialize people who are gone, and their Facebook pages sort of get frozen, but you can still get updates about them, like that it's their birthday. And it can be very disturbing to people, and yet it's also like a constant reminder. And there's a big debate about whether or not that's healthy. Is it healthy that we still have these live Facebook pages, or is that good, is it bad? I actually gave a talk here over a year ago now during the Dirge series about that same thing. And that was actually the first time it was brought up to me. And I was like, that's a thing? So the body as a site of meaning is a problem whether you're alive or in the process of dying or actually already gone. And I think that that is pretty impressive stuff. Is there any last thoughts from anyone before we wrap up? Anyone want to share any last parting words? All right, well, that's okay. Oh, aha, I saw a hand back there. Deidre's got you.
Does this work? Okay. I have a thought floating around in my mind. A few days ago, they performed the first uterus transplant.
Yes.
And we were talking about body parts that might be very closely related to our identities. And that, I think, might be one of them, except that people who are making babies in test tubes have to implant their embryos in a rented womb, more or less. And it's very important for some of these people to meet the woman who is going to be carrying that child, because that it's not just a piece of flesh in which a person can grow. The fetus is experiencing things through that person, and these are also like very personal or identity-linked experiences.
Yes, that's fascinating. That's fascinating, and I did read about that. Doing the birth-death thing it involves these things, but that's a fascinating point. Because we talk a lot about where nurture actually starts. When you start taking on things from your environment, it's when you're in utero, you actually are absorbing things at that time. So it is a fascinating question, and I did a conference in Prague all about reproductive technologies, and there was a very, very large component of that on people who were of the immigrant population in, I think, Norway. It was the immigrant population that was frequently being the sort of rented womb, as you put it, and people wondering if that was a good thing, a bad thing. There was a whole racial and gender component to it that you wouldn't normally expect, and class. So it's pretty fascinating stuff. I'm glad we ended on rented womb. I like that. Womb transplant. I like that. Thank you all very much for being part of the event.